Okay, so back in June in my Unpacking the Male Gaze in Gaming video, I briefly talked about the game Persona 5 and the issues that sprang from the way it pandered to the male gaze. And in that same video, I also mentioned that I was tossing around the idea of writing some gay romance endings for a few of the male confidants. Well, guess what I've finally gotten around to doing? Never let it be said that I cannot commit to a project. Merely let it be said that I'm less punctual than a sloth stuck in molasses in the Arctic with a broken alarm clock. I'm not really feeling up to doing the standard video essayist thing of meandering my way up to the point of the video, so allow me to set your expectations and then we can get started. First of all, I'm only going to give romantic endings to 4 of the male confidants: Ryuji, Yusuke, Mishima, and Iwai. I'm obviously not going to write one for Shinya because he's a child, and I won't be doing one for Morgana because he's a cat. Sojiro won't be getting one because that's your dad and that would be fucking weird. Yoshida is out because I honestly just can't see him willingly dating anyone of any gender who's so much younger than him for moral reasons. And Maruki is similarly out because of the ethical minefield of having been your teacher and your therapist, and also because the man seriously needs to spend some time figuring himself out before he dates anyone else. And I'm not doing it catchy because, well, honestly I just don't like him enough to put in the effort. Plus, the games have already established him and Joker as basically soulmates, and there are more than enough fanfics about him already, so you really don't need my half-hearted attempts at writing romance for him on top of all that. However, I have also written some non-romantic queer content for some of the other male characters in a Patreon exclusive version of this video, which will be available starting at the Rockstar tier for $1. Secondly, and purely for my own comfort, I'm going to be aging the boys up to 18. I don't think it's a choice I need to explain or defend. If you can suspend your disbelief enough to allow for a talking cat fighting evil pumpkins with the soul of Zoro, you can do it for this as well. Third, I've never been a fan of how the Persona games kind of just drop the romance onto you most of the way through a social link, so I'm going to have the signs of romantic feelings, or at least potential, start earlier, just so that we can use some of the time to flesh out the boys' feelings a little more. Finally, this is all in good fun. While I will be explaining my writing decisions, don't take this video too seriously. I'd also like to hear your own takes on what a gay romance for some of the characters would look like, so let me know in the comments. Anyway, that's the end of that, so let's get right into it, shall we? Starting with Ryuji Sakamoto, beloved himbo, certified best boy, and everyone's favorite dumbass sprinter. Ryuji acts as a lot of firsts for the player. Your first friend, your first human ally, the first person to awaken to their persona after you, and quite possibly the first confidant you'll max out since he's free every day that it doesn't rain, and some nights when it does. Likewise, the player acts as his first in a lot of things too. His first friend after being kicked off the track team, the first person to give him a place to belong, and, in the case of this romance, his first gay crush. Ryuji strikes me as the kind of guy to struggle to get in touch with his feelings, since he generally lacks a certain amount of self-awareness, and has a notable temper in the game that lands him in trouble more often than not. But he is a sweet guy who genuinely cares for the people around him, especially Joker. I think Ryuji makes sense as a bit of an oblivious bisexual with a strong lean towards girls, who always wrote off any potential attraction to men as just being part of his runner's high, since the majority of the guys he'd be hanging out with in the past were in the track club, and I think this should be his initial reaction to his feelings for Joker as well, since they spend so much of the confidant training. Where it actually starts the exploration of his potential feelings is during his rank 6 confidant conversation, where he mentions that he feels free when he's with you, and that he likes how he feels when he's talking to you. I think he'd pause for a moment, ask if that's a weird thing for one guy to say to another, and prompt you to respond with either, "It's a little weird," or "Nah, I feel the same way." This wouldn't mechanically set the player on the romance route, but this would do a good job of leading into the rank 7 conversation when you're chatting after eavesdropping on Yamauchi. After deciding to hang out and eat, Ryuji would idly muse that this feels a lot more like a date than your usual ramen hangout. Then, because even Ryuji would realize that might sound a little gay, he'd hurriedly say that you'd probably rather be here with An or Makoto since they're cute. This would prompt 3 possible responses from the player. "It's always better with some girls," "Yeah, I think it would be more fun with all our friends," or "I like it when it's just you and me." No answer here would lock out the potential for dating him, mind you. I'd still have most of the characters be open to romance at rank 9 regardless, but it would allow the player to get a feel for whether they want to date him at all, which I think is an important factor. If you choose the first or second options, Ryuji just laughs and agrees and the scene continues as usual. But if you choose option 3, Ryuji would freeze up for a moment and blush before stuttering out a little scolding for being weirder than he is, but also very quietly admit that it makes him happy to hear that. Moving on to rank 8, I'd change the way the post-beating conversation goes and allow you to tell Ryuji he actually did look cool, which would throw him for a loop. After standing there quietly for a moment, he'd then ask you if you'd still like him if he wasn't cool, prompting 2 ways to ask what he meant before he'd sort of panic and say that the punches must have messed with his head because he can taste blood and has to go home. This would all be a setup for the rank 9 conversation, where the confession would happen. Rank 9 takes place back in the eavesdropping restaurant, and in-game Ryuji explains why he thinks people are drawn to Joker and talks about how he used to never be able to fit in, calling himself a loser who always blamed other people, and says how happy he is that he finally found a place to belong. This is where I'd have him confess. Ryuji would say that if he wants to be the kind of guy you find cool and make sure he's really found his place, then he needs to be honest with himself and honest about his feelings. And then he'd say that, as weird as it is, he thinks he's fallen for you. He says he's scared to admit it because he's never felt like this about another guy before, and that he's afraid that if you don't feel the same way, then he'll be the dumbass who ruined his friendship. But he doesn't want to feel like he's lying to himself or you. From here you would have two options, to reciprocate his feelings or let him down easy. If you let him down easy, you essentially tell him that you don't feel the same way, but that he can never lose his place over something like that, which leaves him disappointed but otherwise happy, and the Confidant will end as it would otherwise. But if you reciprocate his feelings, he slumps in his chair with both relief and disbelief, exclaiming that he thought his heart would explode. Then he lets out a giddy chuckle and says that he can't believe you said yes to a guy like him and that his heart is still beating like he just ran a marathon. But he's never felt any runner's high as good as the rush he's feeling right now. Then, in true Ryuji fashion, he decides it's time to eat more to celebrate and that he's not really sure what two guys do when they go on a date, but he can't wait to find out. This finally brings us to rank 10, where you go back to the ramen shop to talk about the track team's reinstatement and all that good stuff. The only real change here is that I'd actually have it act as if Ryuji and Joker had gone on a couple dates since rank 9. Since Royal added so many outing opportunities and there were already a lot of hangout sessions in the base game, it's really not a stretch to imagine that you already have and that they would take on a more romantic, if somewhat awkward, tone. In this conversation, Ryuji would still talk about how happy he is that you helped him change, but he'd also say that you helped him to accept himself. He'd say that, since you started dating, he's been thinking back to his time with the track team and realizing that he'd always felt something towards the other guys, but he never paid attention because he thought, like I said earlier, that it was just the runner's high. He didn't think he was gay and he certainly didn't think he was bisexual. Then he'd shake his head and say that no, he actually just didn't want to admit it. And after getting kicked off the team, he already felt like such a failure that, in a weird way, acknowledging that part of him would be like admitting defeat. That he was already an outcast and already felt like such a bad son that adding one more thing to set him apart would just be too much. But he doesn't feel that way anymore. Now he has the Phantom Thieves, and now he has you. And now he doesn't feel like he needs to hide who he is. He'd say that he wants to tell his mom about you and introduce you. And then he'd kiss you for the first time. He'd be flustered by the fact that he just did it in public, but he thinks that even if you've got to hide being the Phantom Thieves, you don't need to hide your feelings. Then you get Chi-Yu and that's where that ends. Except not really, because I think he should do something special for Valentine's Day as well. After racking his brain for months trying to figure out something special, he takes you out for a late night run in a neighborhood you haven't been in before, surprising you by stopping at this little ramen shop for a late night treat. He'd say that ramen is kind of your special thing, so he went looking for the best place in the city, asking everyone he knew and even going to Iwai for advice before he finally found this small family-owned shop that mostly served people right after the last train. It might not be anything fancy, but it's hot and tasty and you get to share the experience with him, which makes it all the better. He'd also give you his own homemade chocolate that his mom helped him with, which I just think would be really cute. Anyway, that's it for Ryuji. I like to think that he's a mixture of excited and chill at any given time. Alright, moving on. Yusuke. An artsy boy. A lovely boy. A boy voiced by Matt Mercer. Truly, he has it all. As the second male character recruited into the Phantom Thieves and the first character outside of the Shujin trio plus Morgana, he's necessarily made to contrast Ryuji in as many ways as possible, being relatively calm, understated and artistically skilled, whilst also being comparatively naive, sheltered and lacking in common sense. Also, their colour palettes are almost opposites. However, his personal arc follows the same themes that Ryuji and most of the Confidants share, namely purpose, belonging and justice. And in Yusuke's case, the theme of belonging is wrapped in his explorations of love, between people, parents and for humanity. Because of this, I would actually begin my changes earlier than with Ryuji. I'd put them in during the rank 4 conversation during the boat ride. Joker already has the option to say that he should have brought a girl here, which Yusuke gets excited about because he hadn't even considered the romantic implications of the boat ride at all. Side note, I've always read Yusuke as being somewhere on the error-ace spectrum, so I'm going to be writing him as demi-romantic and demisexual for this. Anyway, Yusuke takes note of the duo in the boat next to you and goes on about desire and the love between a man and a woman, and then goes on a rant about love whilst furiously sketching the two of them before getting their attention, getting rebuffed because they're siblings, and then realizing that his assumptions as to the nature of their relationship had skewed his interpretation of the love between them. Aw, I believe our young artist has just run up against a normativity. Bless his heart. He laments his bias and Joker informs him that love comes in all forms, which I actually think is the perfect segue into the gay stuff we're all here for. Since the siblings assume that Joker and Yusuke are obviously boyfriends since only lovers ride the boats together and Yusuke has no idea what they're talking about, I think this is where Joker should actually explain it instead of them immediately rowing back to shore. The options would be something along the lines of, they think you're my boyfriend, sometimes people are gay, and it's one of the forms love can come in, depending on how cryptic you're feeling. This would prompt Yusuke to admit that he'd never even considered that might be the case, as it wasn't something that was generally talked about in his school or by Madarame, but that he's grateful to have had another form of love revealed to him. It's a small change, but I like it, largely because it's not just another gay joke. Then I'd skip over rank 5 because the church scene is already perfect and deals with agape over a more personal form of love. Rank 6 however, is where I'd bring it back, more specifically when Kawanabe gets involved. He oddly says that he always sees the two together and that they must be very close before stopping in the doorway and saying that the Foundation would support him even if he has that kind of relationship, and then leaving. Yusuke would wonder aloud what kind of relationship he meant. Joker would get a few options that basically boil down to, well, you see, before Yusuke realizes himself that Kawanabe made the same assumption as the siblings. Then he admits that he's never really thought of anyone in that way before and always considered romance to be something that happened to other people. He does, however, say that Joker does mean a lot to him and that he's not really sure of the word for what he's feeling. For rank 7, the only real change I'd make is having Yusuke put more emphasis on how much he appreciates having Joker there for him, when he says the player is a calming influence, and then I wouldn't really change anything for rank 8 because it's already kind of perfect. Rank 9, once again, is where the confession comes in. I think what would happen is that after you're able to tell Yusuke he's changed and Yusuke explains his understanding of the human heart, he pauses for a moment, then continues. I must confess, as much as I believe I've come to understand the human heart, I still feel like my feelings for you have only become harder to comprehend. Joker, you are precious to me, in a way that I've never felt for anyone else. Do you think this is? From there, you'd be given 2 prompts. I think I feel the same way, Yusuke, and you're important to me, but I don't think it's the same feeling. Choosing the latter would cut off the potential romance, and the Confidant would continue as it already is in the normal game. But choosing the former would have Yusuke chuckle. I had hoped you might say that, he'd say. I still don't know if this is what you'd call love, but I'm excited to find out, to see that shining light for myself. He would then leave, saying that he hopes he can find a way to impart this feeling into his artwork. And then he'd call you later to apologize for just leaving, because I think it's both funny and a very Yusuke thing to do. Upon reaching rank 10, I'd actually keep it largely the same. Once again, we're working from the assumption that you will have had a couple of hangout dates with Yusuke in the meantime, and that he'll have begun to understand his feelings a little more. So when Kawanabe speaks to him at the gallery and Yusuke talks about having his rays of hope, he actually reaches out and takes your hand, establishing through action what he struggled to put into words. For his Valentine's date, I think Yusuke would ask you to go back to Madarame's shack, refusing to tell you what for until you arrived, where he reveals that he set up a small area with a selection of snacks with the request that you both draw each other, believing that it would allow him to express his feelings more than he ever could with words alone, as well as allow him to understand how you feel about him in return. Your drawing of him would obviously be absolute garbage in comparison. I don't think he'd hold back in saying it's not very good, but I think it would also bring a tear to his eye, as despite your lack of artistic talent, he can sense your passion and your feeling in every line, and he says he'll treasure it forever. Then he gives you his drawing and says that he hopes that you can understand his feelings all the same. His art would also serve as a room decoration so that you can look at your boyfriend's portrait of you every night. And that's it for Yusuke. I hope I did him justice. Alas, poor Mishima. Favourite only to those who really like guys with the vibe of a kicked puppy. Mishima is an interesting case, as he's one of the first actual supporters you gain, as well as the only person who takes care of their own mementos problem. He's been a victim for a very long time, both by Kamoshida and his own classmates, which has given him a strong sense of justice that becomes warped by his own trauma and need to feel some measure of control. He's also legitimately insightful, being one of the few people capable of sussing out your identities on his own, as well as having a good sense of where the general attitudes of the public lie. I'm going to be writing Mishima as fully gay for this, as my interpretation of him is that a lot of his issues stem from absorbing the toxic mentality that guys are supposed to be a certain way, and that not meeting these expectations is both a moral and personal failing. He's actually quite an interesting character study, as a lot of the issues that crop up in his Confidant, such as trying to use the fan site to pick up girls, or using money from donors to eat at a fancy restaurant, or even trying to sick the thieves on people he doesn't like, all stem from a mentality of toxic masculinity. Amongst other things, men are supposed to attract women and make displays of power, both social and financial, and these are things we see him sort of attempt to do, but his own morality tends to stop him. A lot of it kind of strikes me as the struggle between what he's been told he should want and what he actually wants, so that's what we'll be playing around with in this section. Where I'd start is in the rank 5 conversation where he tells us he bought a model gun for his own protection, and Akiyama shows up to bully him in passing. It wouldn't be a big change, but in the end there when he mentions that he's changed and he's going to help you, I'd have him pause and then stammer that he means he'll help the Phantom Thieves, put a little focus on his focus on you if you know what I mean. Moving on to rank 6, I'd like to add something to the spot where he says the Phantom Thieves' success is thanks to him and that it means he's not a zero. I'm going to have him continue saying, I'm not a nobody, I'm important. I think it's very likely that Mishima was bullied for homophobic reasons, even outside of this rewrite where he actually is gay. I've talked in other videos about how men tend to be socially punished for perceived weakness or femininity that people interpret as a failure of masculinity. And assholes with that attitude tend to view being gay essentially as the ultimate failure and an eternal justification to constantly mistreat someone. Realistically, the attitude that he's probably gay would be why he was made Kamoshida's whipping boy on top of the rest of the bullying, since there's no way in hell Kamoshida wasn't a massive homophobe. Mishima is definitely someone who would have gotten the word fag screamed at them at one point or another, and because there's no actual logic behind that mindset, he'd have no real way of arguing against it, leading to it following him around for quite some time. It's the kind of prolonged treatment that could very easily give a guy a complex. Anyway, Joker would then be prompted to respond to him, and each answer would be some variant of "you're not a nobody to me" or a reminder that he's still important even without the fan site. You wouldn't really know how to respond to that, so he'd just remind you to check the info on the actor and then leave. Moving on to rank 7, I'd take this opportunity to actually flesh out the bullying he went through at Akiyama's hands. I wouldn't make it too graphic since adding too much more abuse to his backstory would cross the line into pornographic, but I'd make it clear that Akiyama just sort of started targeting him one day, calling him useless and a fag and a zero, spreading rumors and just generally making his life miserable, and that these rumors were what led to Kamoshida fixating on tormenting him, claiming that he'd toughen him up and make him a real man. Basically, Akiyama's bullying would lead to Kamoshida trying to beat the gay out of him because it's the only excuse he'd ever need. I think recounting this tale would actually be part of what makes him question if the Phantom Thieves would come to change his heart, since he's basically emulating the behavior of his tormentors as of late, which leads to the talk with his shadow in Mementos and yeah, you know how this goes. What I would do, however, is add more implications to his sexuality in his shadow's rant at Joker, as well as a little breakdown at the end when Joker leaves where he crouches down and cries that he doesn't want you to go because he'll be all alone again. Rank 8 is fine as it is, so let's jump to rank 9 in the confession. I think it should actually come in when he tells you about the documentary he's writing. I think Mishima would pause in thought before saying that he's been thinking about the times Akiyama would bully him for supposedly being gay, and then admit that while he always tried not to think about it, he can't really deny that it's true anymore. Akiyama was full of it and using the claim as an excuse, but Mishima now admits that a lot of the things he thought he wanted were only to get people to leave him alone. That he was just desperate to not be what people picked on him for. But now after everything that's happened, he wants to be honest with himself, and he has you to thank for it. But he's scared that you won't like him anymore now that you know it's true. Especially since he thinks he might just... You can respond to this by saying either that you're proud of him and look forward to maintaining your professional relationship, essentially letting him down easy, or by saying that you might be falling for him too, but he's gonna have to keep your relationship out of the documentary. If you choose the first, he just takes it on the chin and the Confidant continues as it does in the game, but if you choose the second, at first he says he'd never put that in the documentary, and then he'd realize what you mean and get super excited, wanting to order the special juice to celebrate the best day of his life and not even caring about the price. And when he calls you later, it would be to tell you that not only is he starting the script, but he's also going through plans for your first date, and he's not sure which one he's more excited for. Finally at rank 10, again I wouldn't change too much, but I would add a section to his little speech about how he was finally able to change by having him acknowledge that he thinks the reason he was always just boring old Mishima is because he spent so much time trying to make himself less of a target that he ended up losing track of who he was. But thanks to you, he's finally ready to embrace every part of himself, to be someone that he can be proud of in every way that counts. And then for his Valentine's date, I'd have him completely set the fan site aside for the day and take you out to dinner, having carefully saved up enough money doing odd jobs in his spare time to finally take you to that fancy buffet on his own dime. And that's it for Mishima. He was kind of hard to do because not only is he one of the least popular characters in the game, I'm pretty sure it's canon that Joker actually doesn't like him very much. Anyway, moving on. God, this man is reliable. You need guns? He's got guns. You got daddy issues? He's got you covered. Iwai is a big part of the reason I'm aging the characters up for this exercise, because it skeezed me out when the game tried to pair you off with your teacher and the reporter, and it would be just as gross with him. Adults shouldn't be courting or banging minors. I don't give a shit what the context is. That said, I do think there's interesting potential in exploring how he might handle his potential feelings for someone who, while a legal adult in this case, is still a lot younger than him. As someone who's both dated and banged multiple older men at different points in my life, I can tell you from experience that there is no blanket statement of morality on it, so long as both parties are of legal age and the power dynamics are both understood and talked about. It's actually fairly easy to have a healthy relationship with an age gap involved, and that's what I'll be writing for Iwai here. Still, I do understand if the age gap makes you uncomfortable, so all I ask is that you skip over the section if you don't want to hear it, and refrain from unnecessary comments. Please and thank you. Of the 4 men that I'm writing the romance for, Iwai has the least fleshed out backstory and character, or at the very least the simplest to summarize. He grew up with a distinct lack of a loving family, raised by a single mother with severely self-destructive tendencies that drove him to join the Yakuza, which he eventually left to raise Karu after the boy's mother tried to sell him for drug money and then abandoned him. The bulk of his motivations revolve around giving his son the life he never had, though he does become attached to Joker over time and even sympathizes with having a bad reputation that he can't shake. Because, as far as I can remember, Iwai never shows any interest in women in the game or even really talks about them outside of his and Karu's mothers, and because I think it's interesting, I'm going to be writing Iwai as gay and having known since he was young. In real life, the Yakuza tend to recruit a lot of ostracized and socially isolated youths, a description that fits many a young queer man in Japan, though the attitudes of the group tend to pressure guys to take the dominant role, as being otherwise would be an unacceptable display of weakness. Again, I'd bring the subject of Iwai's queerness up in the rank 5 conversation, where he's talking about how he doesn't want Karu to know that he was a Yakuza, and how Suda has a lot of dirt on him. I'd actually have him admit right there that Suda also knows about his past with men, and how he doesn't want Karu to know about that either. Not that he's personally ashamed, but because he doesn't want the reputation of having a gay father to follow Karu either. This game came out in 2016, remember, when the attitude towards homosexuality in Japan was even worse. Considering Iwai's concern about the stigma of his father's reputation following Karu, it's not unthinkable that he'd be concerned that every aspect of his past, his sexuality included, had the potential to harm his son. I'd add a mention of his sexuality when he asks Joker if he doesn't want anything to do with him anymore, saying that he knows what people tend to think about people like him, and I'd actually give the player the option to answer that they also like guys here, to which Iwai would be somewhat surprised, then laugh and say that you shouldn't expect special treatment just because you're more like him than he thought. It would be clear that he appreciates it though, and he says that he'll be relying on you. I wouldn't change much for rank 6, but I would have Karu mention that he's noticed his dad seems happier lately with Joker helping out. Moving on to rank 7. I'd only make a small change here, and that's to actually give the player the option to interject when Iwai says Karu won't end up being anything like him. The first dialogue choice would be to say that you admire who he is now, which would lead to him pulling his hat down and saying that you really shouldn't because he's only doing any of this to protect his son. The second choice would be to ask him what he'd do if Karu was like him, if he was like both of you. I think Iwai would get angry at the implication and yell that Karu will never end up like him before realizing that you meant gay and not a Yakuza, taking a calming breath and then admitting that, for his own sake, he hopes Karu isn't, but it wouldn't change anything. He'd be there for him no matter what. Regardless of which you choose, when Iwai calls you later, he'll pause at the end to tell you that he'll do his best to protect you as well. Now then, what's going to set Iwai apart from the other romance options in this script is that it will actually be on the player to initiate things. Given Iwai's attitude that he needs to protect the people he cares about from his reputation, I don't think he'd admit to any feelings he might have unprompted. So with that in mind, I'd actually have the player do so in rank 8 after taking care of Suda, but before agreeing to work with him again. One of the options when talking to Suda is to say that you did it all for Iwai. If you want to date Iwai, you tell him that you meant what you said to Suda, and when he says he believed you, you tell him you meant more. That you've fallen for him and you want the chance to be with him. Iwai would, of course, be completely shocked, and after taking a moment to process it, he'd say that you have no idea what you're asking for. Not only is he older than you, but you already have your own reputation to deal with, and if people found out what you were asking for, your entire life would be over. From here, you have the option to say, I'm sorry, you're right, and cut it off there with no consequences. But you can also say that you don't care because he's worth it, or that his reputation is nothing compared to the man you fell in love with. With either option, he'd be absolutely stunned and say he needs to think about it. He'd then distractedly add that he could still use your help around the store and that your confession won't play a role in how he treats you, which you obviously take him up on. This reads into rank 9 nicely, as after everything that happens with Karu and Masa, Iwai would be more receptive to perceiving his own worth as a person. When Karu asks if they can go home and eat, Iwai says he'll be ready in a minute and just needs to talk to Joker in private for a minute. Once Karu is out of earshot, Iwai turns to Joker and thanks him for the support before hesitantly asking, "Hey, did you mean what you said about wanting with me?" Here you can either tell him you changed your mind after thinking it over and the Confidant will continue as it would in the game, or you can say that you did and you mean it more than ever. Iwai would take a moment to think, looking flustered, before admitting, while it might not be easy to make work, he can't deny he's grown attached to you and finds it hard to imagine not having you there. He's not sure how he'll break it to Karu that he's dating a guy only a couple of years older than him, but he's willing to give it a try. Then he says that he'll call you later and head off to join his son. The rank 10 conversation is where the biggest changes would be. The first big change is that after the conversation, Kaoru would, before leaving, mention that he needs to talk to his dad later about a guy he likes, since now he knows his dad has some experience there. This would surprise Iwai, but he'd agree and shoo him out of the store, telling his son not to make him regret telling him about his past. Honestly, this is only here because I think it's cute. Anyway, next Iwai would tell Joker that they have to have a serious discussion about their relationship. The first point is that he's re-firing Joker, as it would be unfair to be both his partner and his boss. The next is that he's going to hold off on getting physically intimate until Joker graduates, as that's a mark of adulthood and he wants to be sure that they can feel as close to equals as possible. Finally, he says he wants Joker to eat dinner with him and Kaoru sometime so they can tell his son about their relationship together. If they're going to be together, then Joker should be a part of all of his life. Then I think for Valentine's Day, Iwai would take Joker out to a shooting range and give him a gecko pendant, telling him he hopes that one day they can be a real family together, and that he'll protect you no matter what. I'd also make the pendant an accessory you can equip, and that's it for Iwai. All in all, I like the route I took, but I'd be interested in hearing what you would have done as well. Same for all the boys actually. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Well, that was fun. I hope you enjoyed this little rewrite I made, and if you did, let me know in the comments. I'd be up for doing more videos like this in the future, so don't hesitate to share your thoughts or games you think could use a similar treatment. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye!